this distinguished Ciampi lecture by Beverly Silva, who is a Radio Ciampi visiting scholar at our Faculty of Social and Political Sciences at Scuola Normale Superiore. We are very grateful to have a scholar like Beverly here. She's a professor of sociology at the Johns Hopkins University, and she has had a very interesting trajectory of studying capitalism, both across time and across places, combining history and, say, geography, with regard in particular to labor movements and the directions of development, social development, economic development. Some of her books are extremely influential. I would mention only two: Chaos and Governance in the Modern World System with Giovanni Arrighi, and Forces of Labor, Workers' Movements and Globalization since 1870, a book that keeps inspiring reflections about the directions of labor movement. And here in this faculty, we will have a conference on labor power with the participation of Beverly next week on Monday and Tuesday. So an extremely fertile, extremely inspiring production in her publications. And more recently, Beverly has been reflecting about changes in hegemony. Different hegemonies across times within capitalism. And this will be the topic of the lecture today. The title is Hegemonic Transitions and International Order. We will have then two discussants, and we'll open the floor to questions about the lecture. So thank you very much, Beverly, for being with us this month in Florence, and we're listening to you.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation and for the chance to discuss this with you today. Today's lecture is going to, in some sense, be a revisit of the book we published in 1999 called Chaos and Governance in the Modern World System. I've also put up the first edition published in Italian by Bruno Mondadori, and the more recent second edition published by Mimesis. And I always thought it should be Nel Mondo, but I see it's Del Mondo. But anyway, that can be a subject for another day. I was certain we had gone with Nel Mundo, but anyway. So the Chaos and Governance, when we published it in 1999, was being written during the 1990s. I would say that it had two goals. One was to dissipate the fog that surrounded the debates about what kind of period of world history we were in the late 1990s. So on the one hand, it was this unipolar moment. It was after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States was left standing as the sole superpower. It was a period of takeoff of financialization of capital, the growing financial expansion, the growing importance of finance in global capitalism, and all sorts of debates about the meaning of that, whether it was a new stage, whether it was another highest, whether it was another last stage, what was the meaning of financialization that was taking place. And in the 90s, well, in retrospect, of course, the financialization of the 90s, people were already recognizing it, but it was very much in its early stages. Also in the 1990s, certainly by the time we published Chaos and Governance in 1999, it was also a period of pretty widespread crises for labor movements, and not just in the core, which had been the case in the 1980s, but it had become not a universal crisis, but certainly widespread, not just simply limited to core countries. This was the time when there was the discussion of, Fukuyama had put forward his thesis of the end of history. Thomas Friedman shortly after was talking about the world being flat. There was Tina, there is no alternative to capitalism. Globalization, there was a lot of literature on globalization being unstoppable and the relationship between globalization and these theories of globalization, democracy, peace. European, of course, this was also a time that there was optimism in relation to the European Union in terms of the EU project. And so the book starts from all this kind of debates out there about the different aspects of that current period in world history. It's also like after two decades of debt crises and structural adjustment and sort of a kind of return to domination and relations with the third world, although not return to formal colonialism. And so, but there was a lot of confusion too about where things were headed. And so one goal of the book was to try and use comparative historical, longue durée historical methods in order to think about really what the 1990s, what that unipolar moment really was. And the main thesis, of the book was that actually, even though it looked like the United States had come back in a kind of remarkable, almost Phoenix-like way from the deep crisis of the 1990s, the defeat in 1990s. I'm sorry, I meant to say 1970s, the defeat in Vietnam. The run on the dollar, that by the 1990s, all that seemed to be resolved, the crisis of the 1970s, that the main thesis of Chaos and Governance was that, in fact, we were still in a crisis of hegemony, and that what looked like a new spring, what the Bush Jr. administration was certainly going to mistakenly take as an opportunity to launch a project for a second American century in 2000 and 2001, which, as we know, was a disaster. But that, in fact, the Belle Epoque of the 1990s, this unipolar moment, was in fact the autumn before the winter. So the fundamentals of the crisis of hegemony hadn't been resolved, but were in fact, and the temporary resolution was one that, through the financialization, was one that stood on extremely unstable grounds, extremely shaky grounds. There's an interesting, I don't, try to avoid going off on too many asides, but it's interesting that in 1981, Giovanni Righi wrote a piece on the crisis, published in this book called Dynamics of Global Crisis, and the title of the piece was A Crisis of Hegemony. And so already, I'll talk about ways in which the whole thing evolved, but it's kind of interesting that already in 81, 82, he had this kind of intuition that what this, long phase was already characterized by some kind of complex, what, kind of now goes by the term polycrisis. So that's the first, the first thing, and the book, that was the thesis put out in the introduction, but then there were two aspects. One was that through comparing the present with previous hegemonic transitions in the long array of historical capitalism, we could begin to try and understand more about the specificities of the current period. And then also by understanding how historically in the past, that all of these hegemonic crises had ended in a long period of systemic chaos and systemic breakdown, with wars, conflict, and tremendous human suffering. That one of the kind of or the second goal, let's say. So the first goal would be to kind of try and understand the historical moment, and the second goal was to attempt to understand what might be necessary in order to avoid another long period of systemic breakdown and chaos. So at that time, there was this idea, and I think time to go to this slide, that we were, that we were in, actually, let me jump, oh, darn, I knew I was going to do that. Okay, I'm jumping here. So this is a figure from the book that sums up the narrative of the comparison of the transition from Dutch to British hegemony and from British to US hegemony. And this, there's my additions here, which basically mark the 1970s as a period of initial hegemonic crisis. For those of you who are familiar with the long 20th century, signal crisis. The period in which Chaos and Governance was published was this Belle Epoque, after the initial kind of takeoff of the financialization. There's a kind of Belle Epoque of US wealth and world power, and also a Belle Epoque for capitalism. But that the idea was, we're writing at that time of transition from hegemonic crisis, and again trying to avoid the move into systemic chaos or hegemonic breakdown. So so let me I guess let's go back here. So that's the kind of twofold goal, which was, one was just to understand the current period, but then more proactively, in terms of structure and agency. There was, even though the previous hegemonic transitions had ended in a long periods of systemic chaos, we were proposing that it wasn't inevitable and that there were things that could be done to avoid that, right? And so the problem is, and we'll get back to it later, that by 2025, so today, the question of avoiding, unfortunately, right, the question of avoiding the period of systemic chaos is kind of moot, in the sense that there's kind of widespread agreement that we're in the period of systemic chaos. The two things that we had put forward in the conclusion about avoiding systemic chaos was the need for the US specifically and the West more broadly to adjust gracefully to a more equal distribution of wealth and power in the world. And so we've seen over the last 25 years, like, anything but that has happened, whether it's through the Project for a Second American Century or more ambiguously, but nevertheless under Obama with the pivot toward East Asia, the kind of attempt to focus on delaying or stopping the rise of China, and then the kind of various versions of MAGA. So, and then the second avoiding of a period of systemic chaos was some kind of that we argued that the new hegemonies were always based on a reorganized capitalism and a new kind of vision that included like a social element to it that recognized some of the demands and problems left behind by the previous hegemony and the kind of demands that were coming up through the social movements, protests, and revolutions that characterized the period of crisis and breakdown. So I'll come back. So the point that I want to make is that the book is actually I find to go back and read it and think about it to be extremely interesting, but for some years now, like one has to shift one's head in reading it from this question of how does one avoid to what is the story about how to get out of the systemic chaos with the least amount of human suffering, and perhaps with also a world still intact. So this is yeah. Okay. So there we go. Okay. So this is the same figure, but just with this concept of virtuous and vicious circle being added. I was kind of interesting because here I added a bunch of additional arrows going in different directions to get more the sense of this vicious circle. And I'm thinking that's part of it. The simplification in the actual published version, I think, has to do with we're kind of being focused on the earlier period. But anyway, so there are a few things that now I wanted to go through a few things specifically about the period of hegemonic breakdown and past periods of hegemonic breakdown and their implications for the present. So so what I've circled here, so I'm going to circle different parts of the figure, so we can kind of focus in on different parts successively. But here I've circled the escalation of interstate conflict and interstate power struggles and social conflicts. So this is the war and revolution type of point here. So on Monday, in the discussion with Wolfgang Streeck, there was the issue of how wars, world wars, wars between the great powers, inter-imperialist wars, whatever, characterize past periods of world hegemonic transition, right? And yes, that's part of what's going on. But as I was trying to say on Monday, that it's not, there's something about the wars themselves, but it's not entirely the wars themselves, but how the war and social conflict and mass protests from below, in a sense, get intertwined and so and how that relates to what happens afterwards. So very importantly, like if we think of the late 18th and early 19th century, there's a whole series of revolutions, but probably most important from the point of view of thinking about both transformation of capitalism and new hegemonies is the Haitian Revolution and a series of revolts by enslaved people throughout the Americas, which made continuing capitalism based on plantation slavery impossible. So the new hegemony that emerges after in the early mid 19th century under British world leadership, plantation slavery is slowly eliminated. Of course, in its place, we get a tremendous expansion of formal colonialism. So I'm going to take a step back here, because in order for you to be able to follow what I'm talking about, I need to step aside for a second and tell you the definition of hegemony that we're working with. Because without this definition of hegemony that we're working with, it doesn't make, why I'm emphasizing this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So in the literature, in international IR literature, international relations literature, a lot of the sometimes hegemony is used as synonymous with domination, right? And in other, Gramscian-inspired literature, hegemony is understood as as rule through a combination of force and consent, right? So force in relation to the let's call it, say, class enemies in the Gramsci language, and consent in relation to allies. And so that so in periods where, let's say, this virtuous circle periods, right, there's a strong element of consent, right? And it's not universal. There's also a strong element of force, but there's enough of a basis of consent beyond the narrow ruling group that it allows for some form of a virtuous circle of systemic expansion, etc. So, so what this consent breaks down over time, which is one of the elements, again, that I'm not going to focus on the breakdown part. We're jumping to assuming we're in the breakdown, but also all of the new hegemonies involved the formation, as you can see in the last column, of a new hegemonic social bloc, meaning that there was a new kind of basis of consent around which it was built. So this is the war and revolution, right, picture for the transition from British hegemony to US hegemony. Right. So this is the World Labor Group database. It's the number of reports globally of labor unrest from 1870 to 1996. And again, you see the strong influence of the two world wars in these high points and major, world historical waves of labor unrest on a global scale. that the two high points are right after World War I and after World War II. But the key thing is, again, that it's not the wars in themselves, but the ways in which the wars interconnect with first, the Russian Revolution, its aftermath, the Chinese Revolution, its aftermath, and its global implications, and how, again, both of these are tied up with decades-long struggles for national liberation, anti-colonialism, etc. And so, again, we have a new that the hegemony has, the new hegemony, the US has to in some way find a reformist solution to the problems left behind, right? And to these demands from below. Okay, this is another element of, oh God, I keep it wrong one, even though I know I shouldn't. Okay, this is another element. Again, I'm just trying to pull out different elements of this hegemonic breakdown period to kind of focus in on them. Disintegration of the whole old hegemonic bloc and escalation of social conflicts. So if we're thinking about the social bloc that characterized the period after the Second World War, part of it involved in an incorporation of the mass production working classes in the core, primarily industrial working classes, primarily white male, incorporated into this kind of mass production, mass consumption social compact. There also an incorporation of various like third world elites through this developmental project. And the disintegration, after the 1970s of this kind of both social compact with the core working class and the social compact through developmentalism with the third world has led to an escalation of kind of particular new types of social conflict. So, so here, one thing, I thought I put another, yeah. So here I need what I call a theoretical conceptual interlude in order to kind of get you to be able to explain more concretely what I'm talking about here. So I can't work with or make sense of this concept of hegemony without embedding it in a conceptualization of historical capitalism. And in particular, this kind of fundamental theoretical conceptual insight that you can get from Marx, from Polanyi, from actually even from Durkheim, Weber, from there are different ways you can pull it out, right? But of a fundamental contradiction between the pursuit of profitability and the maintenance of social legitimacy. So in all of this, now I'm going to repose all of this tendency toward crisis of hegemony, right, in the context of this fundamental contradiction between the pursuit of profitability and the maintenance of social legitimacy. So this contradiction within capitalism means that it's always kind of moving in tension between falling into a crisis of profitability or falling into a crisis of social legitimacy. And we can see that, at all sorts of different scales. We can see it within workplaces. We can see it at the national level. We can see it at the global level. Here, to some extent, I'm more kind of, in this talk, more focused on how it plays out at the global level, but it has interconnections at all those different levels. So to toss you another figure here, this is a different way of thinking about where we are today. This is just looking at the long 20th century, and it's looking at four crises of capitalism, four major crises of capitalism over the long 20th century. And the key thing, well, the first thing that I'm trying to point to is that the top crisis, it goes, you know, the top, we go more to the present as we go from bottom to top, right? So this crisis 4 is the crisis that we're in now. If we think about it in terms of hegemony, it's the crisis of hegemonic breakdown, systemic chaos, terminal crisis of US hegemony. If we think about it in terms of this tension between profitability and legitimacy, it's a crisis of a deep crisis of social legitimacy. So the 70s, you know, again, all these crises have both an element of crisis of social legitimacy and crisis of profitability, but there's something that, you know, triggers it more and that is more dominant in it. And the crisis of the 1970s was very much triggered by a squeeze on profitability, and then capital reacted in all sorts of ways, and then the movements, and right. But this crisis was, sorry. Was resolved through, okay, through the financial expansion. As you see, resolution 3 is the financial expansion. I had a whole bunch of more things where I went through different slides and circled different things, and then I said, oh, let me simplify it. And then now I'm trying to talk about it, and I said, I wish I should have left that slide in because it would have been more efficient, but never mind. Okay. So, so quickly, I would just want to, you know, looking at it from this angle, right? And if you know, look back and forth and whatever a little bit more clearly, but anyway, so, you know, our breakdown of hegemony periods, right? So, in this figure, you know, are the terminal crises, and the historical analogy is very much, you know, the 30s, you know, and 40s. If you look at the top, and then I'll move on. But if you look at the top, you know, because this looks like the way again the figure plays out historically is that there's a pendulum swing between the crisis of profitability and the crisis of legitimacy, and a resolution with a redistribution either in favor of capital or in favor of labor, right? So, and just as one last point to try and hopefully help people understand what's going on here, up at the top, this was originally written for a Carl Polanyi conference. So, you know, another way to think of it for people who are who think in Polanyian terms, right? That it's a pendulum swing between periods where the protection of fictitious commodities is too high from the point of view of capital, right? And periods where the protection of fictitious commodities is too low from the point of view of capital. Okay. Now, hopefully for some people this was clarifying. If not, we move on. Okay. So what's yeah. what's going on here. So if we think about the, post-war, the 50s and 60s, right? And the US-led response to the mass waves of socialist movements, national liberation movements, labor movements in the first half of the 20th century, that there was some kind of form of, let's call it a global New Deal, and certainly a promise of redistribution and even some moves toward a redistribution, a decrease in a redistribution toward labor. Since 2008, right? The very first time I did this figure, it was in 2008, and the very early version of this figure. And I had the arrow, what's the dashed arrow, going toward a resolution through a redistribution, right, through greater equality. That I had that as not a dashed arrow, but just a straightforward arrow, because it seemed to me that it should be obvious to those in power that now that the crisis had come back to the core, because we had decades of debt crises that were, kind of extremely destructive successively in Latin America and Africa, Eastern Europe, East Asia, right? And now it's come back to the core, right? So that's why we call it the financial crisis, right? It comes back to the core, it hits the US in particular. So at that point, that there would be some kind of realization, okay, neoliberalism has gone too far. An elite-led adjustment, and instead, 8 years of Obama and the levels of inequality within the U.S., most other places in the world were even far greater than they were, even greater than they were in 2008. Then, part of the predictable reaction to this, which gets me back to, let me just here, disintegration of old hegemonic social bloc, right? So is it was the rise of these far right movements. So I added this morning when I was thinking about it, one, there's other issues about why that line should be dashed, right? But that if there's no hegemonic solution, vision to this crisis, right? Then we end up with the fascist kind of neo-fascist turn, right? So 2008 to 2016, right? If Europe hadn't, if Europe hadn't gone down the kind of austerity rabbit hole, if the US, if the kind of IMF in relation to the world had backed away from harsher structural adjustment, but instead they kind of just brought even more parts of the world into this kind of structural adjustment, austerity, imposing this kind of austerity policies. I don't know, that's counterfactual history, but what we know is these things weren't done, and we've gotten globally in different ways this successive kind of resurgence of a far right fascist kind of neo-fascist turn. So So that's back to that. This is just quickly. We've got this new data collection project where we're going through the world's newspapers, not the world's newspapers, but we're taking the international reporting of kind of major core newspapers, and this is and it goes from 1850 up to 2023. I'll show another the aggregate picture in a minute, but this is the kind of fashion, the figure that just, by the way, just look at the blue line, but it's the figure that pulls out the reports where fascist, anti-fascist kind of struggles are mentioned. And again, we get these two periods as peaks, as the 1930s and the past decade. And if I add the more recent, it'll go up even higher. So, and so let me go back here. Another way to think about it is these are, elite projects, and one is a kind of elite social democratic return of Keynesian project, right? And the other is an elite project that attempts, at some kind of, anyway, right. I don't need to say, I mean, if I just say like, kind of Keynesian, and then something, anyway, the opposite, a move away from austerity, let's call it that. And the other is this elite project, which is, kind of a fascist, neo-fascist turn as an elite project. And, and so, just like if we look at, and okay, and if we put it again in the context of here, that if to move the elite project in the dashed line direction, it would mean sharing wealth. You're right. So anyway, let me. I have a final slide that comes back to this, so I think it'll be easier to talk about it in relation to that. Okay. Another way, I realized I was talking to the wrong slide. Forgive me. I had gone back here and I was talking to the wrong slide. Sorry about that. This is the slide I meant to be talking to. Let me. All right. I can't resist. Back for a second. In the news, yeah. So this is like the spectacle of the Oval Office of Trump in the Oval Office the other day with the president of South Africa. We see, this kind of fascist, neo-fascist, strongly racist type of turn. It I'm gonna have to come back to this. Okay. Okay. So this is the last I think if we're thinking about the sources of a new hegemony, right? We have to look to this part of the figure, right? So the emergence of new social strata, classes, groups as a result of the material expansion, the kind of conflicts, the kind of protest that comes out of these groups, and the formation of a new hegemonic social bloc. So I'm going to show two more slides. This was the old World Labor Group data, and we see that when we ended the collection in the 1990s, labor unrest was at a historically low period globally. Then we started this new data collection project after the 2010, 2011 kind of waves of protest. And we've now brought it up to 2023, and this is what it looks like. This is kind of all forms of social protest. This is going back to the 1850s. You see social protests rising in the first half of the 20th century, it being kind of highish, but relatively stable in the post-war periods, this trough in the 1990s, and then this new upsurge since 2011, but escalating. And this is based on, again, on newspaper reports. I can talk a little bit more about the basis of this, but it's a kind of global, all forms of social protest. So, one thing that we're doing, and I won't have time to talk about it, but we'll have lots of time for the discussion. So I'll come back. I'll come back in the discussion for different things, and also maybe be a little bit more concrete with current examples. But is if you think about past hegemonies as being based on trying to come up with reformist solutions to the revolutionary challenges from below, then if we're thinking about how to get out of the systemic chaos now, the problem is how to think about solutions, maybe not reformist, because I don't think there are reformist solutions, these kind of challenges. So to look and see what are the demands that are coming up from below in this like post 2011 wave of social protests. What is the nature of these things? Who are the participants? And here, I'm subtracting the kind of neo-fascist type of mobilizations in response to the kind of breakdown. And what kind of new social compacts at the local level, at the national level, at the global level could meet the kind of demands that are emerging from below. So, a couple things about this figure. That when I first kind of added on, because before the data ended in 2016, and it was up to 2016, it was very high. And then 2019, it goes really high. I think 2024, it might even be higher than 2019, but, you know, we haven't done it yet. But we've, you know, with a, anyway. So at first I said, well, you know, this maybe there's something like exaggerated about the data, you know, that it's too much. And then I began to think about it differently. And I began to think, you know, maybe this is telling us something, how high it is. That, and also maybe telling us something about why ruling groups are not even trying a reformist solution, right? They're just going for repression. They're just going for really heavy, heavy repression in different, you know, in different ways, all different forms, all, you know. And, you know, maybe, you know, that that this is what it looks like to them, right? that this looks like such a widespread rejection of the system as it now exists. Its failure to meet basic human needs, livelihood, safety, needs, planetary needs of the continued existence, right? You know, confronting climate change. That all these, and there are different elements of these kind of demands that are represented in this huge wave of protests that shows up in this figure, that they kind of have, you know, some of them are building their bunkers, you know, to go into their bunkers when, like, some of them are planning their escape to Mars, you know, but they're not really kind of offering much in the way of solution. And I think they probably, maybe correctly, understand that there is no solution to the kind of problems that we face, the kind of problems we've inherited from 5 centuries of historical capitalism, from you know, a long 20th century of U.S.-led capitalism that has been particularly you know, treating resources, nature as a free good, right? And that you know, that they can't. I'm going to try to go back. So they can't. They can't do that dashed line, right? They can't solve the crisis of social legitimacy and still have, like, anything that looks like profits, right? And so they've, you know, gone the way they're not doing it. That's my current thought. And again, my thought about why that picture, it's probably, there may be some data issue still, you know, we have to check, but it's not a huge data anyway, never mind. But that picture, you know, may actually turn out to be correct. It's the and I'll tell as an anecdote, that the 1936, the first time I saw the 36 in this, I also thought, oh, you know, maybe there's something wrong with our data, right? Because in the World Labor Group data, it's like 1919, 1945. It's the 2 peaks after the wars. And I was saying, well, okay, why is 36 showing up here? And it turns out that the reason 36 was showing up was because we went in and looked more closely at the data, was because of the fascist, anti-fascist clashes leading up to the Spanish Civil War, you know. And you know, so you know, I said, okay, well, maybe the data is showing something real. You know, it's like a little distressing that, because it's the analogy between with today is then, right? Anyway, so Then something else has been, and I'll try to end soon because I know I've gone over time. But something else has been kind of, okay. So as I mentioned at the beginning, or toward the beginning anyway, this concept of hegemony from Gramsci, is hegemony, or, rulers exercises power through a combination of consent and force, consent toward the allies and force toward the enemies, right? And then he's got this thing, where he says between consent and force stands corruption, fraud, which is characteristic of certain situations when it's hard to exercise the hegemonic function and when the use of force is too risky. We don't know, right now, the use of force, but there is, I think that, that there's also some inhibition on like the full out use of force everywhere all the time because of, but this thing of corruption and fraud. So, and I think it's an important thing to develop because in two ways that I've put down there at the bottom of the slide. One is, corruption, fraud, like as a form of rule. So, buying people off. So Trump puts in these tariffs that are going to the first time around, right? That they damage the farmers, the agricultural workers, because not workers, but farmers, because they can't export to China. So then he buys them off with, bailouts, right? So, and then there's all sorts of kind of the way in which, again, the tariffs or they just passed some crazy budget bill the other day, and right, and there's all this kind of rule through fraud, right. Then there's also the question of capital accumulation, because where profits are coming from. This whole period of neoliberalism, that a lot of profits, or let's call it wealth generation, has come through redistribution. But there's a certain point where the redistribution just can't go on anymore, right? I mean, there's a mathematical limit for one thing, like you just can't, right? And then there's the social limit, which we're also seeing, that there's only so much inequality that can be justified socially. So, again, there's a tremendous amount of, I think, I got to work it out a little bit, think about it a little bit more. But, if we go from profits coming through material production, right, then wealth coming through redistribution, because that's pretty much what's been happening over 20 years, the profitability. Right? And now maybe coming through the role of corruption and fraud. I am way over time, so this was something about overlapping S-curves, which I can go back to. This is something about evolutionary patterns, which happen. Oh, God, I'm going on the wrong one again. Okay, yeah, sorry about the Spanish. I gave a talk in Peru. Huh? Yeah. So again, this is, and maybe this will come up in the discussion. Just quickly try to show this, but because again, in terms of now thinking about the future, if we, assuming that I find this extremely useful, is to think about us about historical capitalism and the systemic cycles of accumulation or hegemonies, thinking about them as overlapping S-curves, right, where the end of one systemic cycle overlaps with the beginning of a new one, and that we're at the end of the US-led systemic cycle accumulation or hegemony, and something new may be emerging. We don't, right? So that's the question. This is, and then these are just, again, sorry about the Spanish again, but the left is the the leading government function. So the reason I put this up is it just relates to the discussion on Monday, showing going from city states to nation states to possibly world state. That's the left column. Then, yeah, there. And I'm not going to talk about it because I can't. But we can come back to it in the discussion. And then this kind of right set of columns. That's U.S. military bases. I'll leave it aside. There's a lot of them in the world. Okay. This is the Silk Road, which has like kind of been there. I should have a picture of the Belton Road, but so like this was meant to show the difference between the kind of U.S. international footprint and China international footprint. So the heavy, a very strong trade footprint, but not. Okay. And this is the last slide. Again, which is that this is the internalization of different costs, and the idea is that the costs of protection were internalized during Dutch hegemony, world hegemony. The costs of production were internalized during British hegemony. The costs of transactions were internalized during US hegemony with multinational corporations. And then the costs of reproduction, that's the no, right, have never been internalized. So meaning they've always been externalized, they've always been treated as something that can feed profits, but so it's a different way of coming back to this final question, which is both how one moves toward an internalization of the cost of reproduction, how, put differently, how one moves towards a system globally, locally, that values human livelihood and the protection of humans and nature over profitability, over profits, the production of profits, and what are the social forces that are in a position to move us in that direction. So essentially the move out of the systemic chaos requires some solution to that thing that has never been solved within capitalism historically, and in fact has been made worse and worse over time. It involves some solution to that, and I think the discussion becomes who is and what is. Yeah, sorry, I totally, it's misjudged time, but yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Beverly, for this fascinating range of reflection, and time obviously is complicated. And obviously any reference in this concept of corruption and fraud, any reference to actually existing governments either here or the other side of the oceans are purely accidental and unintended. It's a purely abstract concept. We now move to two discussants. The first one is Dario Di Conzo, who is a research fellow here in our faculty. He has just completed a PhD dissertation on the trajectories of labor conflict in China, which is, well, the big, complicated new actors. Well, a new actor when we talk about hegemonic transitions in the last couple of decades. Dario, please.
Thank you, Guglielmo. Thank you, Beverly, for your inspiring lesson. I was asked to focus on China, so I will try to do a step forward in your reasoning, starting from China as main driver of the current material expansion of a new potential systemic cycle of accumulation. My first general question for you is knowing your perception of US-China confrontation from your world system perspective, because I think there is a general consensus about China as new rising power, and also about, I would say, that we are witnessing a systemic chaos right now, unfortunately. But I will try to be more specific on one issue that it's quite puzzling for me, because I think we can agree about China as a new main driver of material productive expansion of contemporary capitalism, and even if we think and we inflected this in terms of greener and cleaner industrial transition, China is today one of the leading country in production of solar panels, EVs, electric vehicles, just to quote the most easy and evident examples. But I think there is also an ideological and political side. If we compare Trump administration and Xi Jinping in terms of narratives, since 2019, China introduced in its constitution what they call ecological civilization. That is, of course, sustainable growth and a peaceful coexistence between human being and nature. And today, this kind of conceptualization of ecological civilization is part of Xi Jinping thought on socialism for a new era. So there is both sides, the production side and the ideological and political side. However, you at the end of your presentation, you even show us the Belt and Road Initiative. Actually, I think that this is interesting because on one side, what I just said about a more fruitful potential relation between China and a new ecological regime, it seems at least better than how United States is declining these. However, the Belt and Road Initiative is mainly related to infrastructure, consuming China overproduction capability in cement, in steel, pipeline through Central Asia, from Pakistan, from Iran. I did some study about this. For me, my interpretation is matter of energy security for China, the Belt and Road Initiative, and of course, can be also inflected as a win-win trade relationship with other rising economic partners in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Central Asia, or even just Eastern Europe. But I think there is a clear contradiction between the idea of build new infrastructure, a new human presence in very remote area of the Eurasia platform, and the other side of the story, China as a new leading country in green technology, research and development. I think this is an interesting contradiction to ask you something, and in general, I think it is interesting for us try to do a step forward to discuss China as new hegemon, because you deserve credit for having anticipated the East Asia rise, but today is a common topic. This idea of also not the new Thucydides trap between China and United States, and also China can be a responsible stakeholder to ease the current chaos, or structurally China is destined to augment the chaos in this confrontation with the United States. I think that are not easy questions, but can be useful for us. Thank you again very much, and I think it is Mario's turn.
Thank you very much, Dario. And we move to the second discussant, who is Professor Mario Pianta. He is the president of the Carlo Azeglio Ciampi Institute of Advanced Studies here, and is also professor of economic policy, who also has an in-depth knowledge of this literature, because as far as I understand, he translated into Italian some of the early works by Giovanni Arrighi. So please, Mario.
Thank you. Thank you, Beverly, for this wide-ranging discussion. I think this discussion is important because in my understanding is the best way we can integrate, on the one hand, the dynamics of the economic dynamics of capitalism with its cycle of accumulation, and on the other hand, the political dynamics of state and interstate system with the cycles of hegemony. And I think this is the framework in which this approach can be quite fruitful, and also because it gives us a sense of the nature of the crisis, which is not a deterministic one. There is not a crisis and a mechanistic, easy, obvious solution to the crisis, but the crisis is a complex, long-term process. And in particular, this concept of chaos, of systemic chaos when we are facing an hegemonic crisis is, I think, very important to understand the present. Otherwise, we are squeezed by confusing types of arguments. For instance, this approach is a very important counterforce to a dominant narrative about the return of geopolitics as the dominant way for understanding the world and internet and state behavior and so on. So this is a healthy counterforce to the flattening of our understanding of the complexity of the systems, and in particular of the power logic that drives states. Let me remind you of how anticipatory such approach has been. For a decade after the 2008 crisis, I often quoted the passage from Chaos and Governance when Reagan wrote in 1999, at the peak of the financial expansion. They said the financial expansion of today is not a sign of a new stage of world capitalism, it's the sign of an impending crisis. And in 2008, we had the crisis. But at the time, not only the Fukuyama and the world is flat, but also all the economists were saying there is no more business cycle, there is no more macroeconomics, that's the end of the problems. We have solved the problems of business cycles. So there was a complete stupidity of mainstream views, and the perspective that the world system approach gave us was a very important anchor for that. And again, now we can use this argument and the concept of systemic chaos as a way for understanding complexity of trends, contradictory trends, which in the mainstream narrative is explained mainly by geopolitical interest, power struggles, and rather silly type of arguments. So within this element, I think it's very important to take the argument of hegemony right with its complexity and power, and this contrasts with an extremely weak way in which the mainstream literature, for instance, the international relations literature, has approached the current crisis of U.S. Power with no understanding of the basic roots of it. So, as Beverly was saying, there is a paradox between an elite thinking, not just an elite acting in terms of power, which goes in the old direction without an understanding that change in paradigm, in conceptual paradigms, is needed alongside a change in major policies. So I think the important thing that we can take home from Beverly is this conceptual frame that can be a useful way in which we put each of our empirical or PhD projects or investigations. And the other very important element is that within these two blocks, accumulation of capital and state power and hegemonic power, we have space for society and social conflict, and it is very relevant the way in which the work at the Arrighi Center have brought in the importance of the sequence of social conflict as an indicator of the contradiction of the system. Social conflict tend to be domestic in nature, because of but we have had an increasing transnational dimension since the age of neoliberal globalization in the 90s. So a specific question I would like to ask Beverly has to do with in comparing the hegemonic crisis of the 30s and the hegemonic crisis of today. A lot of issues have clearly shifted to a fully global nature. The ecological crisis, of course, the North-South colonial contradictions, but a number of labor issues now have to be addressed on a global scale, as also your work has shown. So, what this novel global scale of contradictions and the greater emphasis on supranational and transnational processes vis-à-vis purely domestic processes can change a little bit the dynamics and the interaction. While the 30s were a period of breakdown of the international order, self-sufficiency, protectionism, isolationism of different countries, this type of approach, as the failure of Trump's tariff strategy shows, is hardly available as an option today. And the strategy of China, as Dario also has emphasized, is a strong counter force to this. So if, and of course, the closing within the national boundaries was a key ingredient of the fascist hypothesis of solution to the crisis in Italy, Germany, Spain, and so on. So if we take seriously the irreversible global nature of a lot of this contradiction, what is going to change in this framework? And the other element that was already discussed on Monday, so I will not, I just mentioned it, is of course the question that in a chaotic system, the use of war and the use of military power becomes an option, is increasingly an option. There is if we had the map of interstates or within state armed conflicts, we would have the same trajectory of peaks. By the way, this is an interesting idea for a paper. So I think in this sense, the question of war becomes relevant. This was already discussed on Monday, but in this sense, there is a greater risk in the failure to provide order. Last point, the counter forces for reconstructing an international order. Hegemonic or pluralist could be an open question. Dario already pointed out that China and East Asia are pushing to a new trajectory of material expansion in the real economy with important economic success and important policy choices, correct policy choices. In this context, Chinese policy and a lot of policies emerging from the south of the world, the BRICS and so on, are pushing for a continuation of a multilateral system, for a continuation of international cooperation, which is the opposite of the Trump US strategy of breaking down the old order. So if we are in a context where global dynamics are much more important than in the 30s, in a context where the maintenance of an international order is more urgent in order to address the complexity of the problems, a novel challenge may become a more explicit way in which a transnational social bloc in favor of reconstructing an international order could emerge. So these are more questions. Today is the day of questions. So a few answers, but more questions. Thank you, Beverly.
Now, if there are already questions, either from the floor or from online, I can see already one hand. We take one or two questions more. Is that okay?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good idea. People have been sitting for a long time. Yeah.
We'll give the floor to Beverly.
Thank you. I'm Darlene Miller from South Africa, an old student of Beverly. So just to say thank you to Professor Silver for continuing the Arrighi Silver tradition on our own, unfortunately now, because it is the Arrighi Silver tradition that has often been so prescient and able to read the future in a way that very few other intellectuals are often able to do. So I hope my phone doesn't die because I have some difficult questions for myself to ask. So the first is a difference with the 1929-34 parallel. And it relates to the unevenness of the uneven development of social conflict, where global social protest is more atomized on the left. So on the one hand, you have a stronger sense of a collective dynamic in the far right that we don't see in the global left. So the social protest indices might be going up, but we don't see the same kind of collective project that we saw when we had fascism on the one side and socialism on the other side. And so what are the implications of that? And I feel that consent is still a very strong aspect of this systemic crisis. Consent amongst the laboring masses is secured through the forms of mass communication that are inclusive. We're not just excluded, we are included through the cell phone. We live vicariously through the lives of celebrities, and we are atomized through the hyper-individualism of the virtual reality that we inhabit. Our citizenship is part virtual. Would the implication be that we will be relegated to spectator status while the far right mobilizes and takes us towards global fascism? In other words, that our hyper-individualism will allow neo-fascism and global apartheid to succeed where Hitler failed. And then a second question, sorry for these long comments. A second question is about the form of the multinational corporation, because each phase of hegemony, if we look at the chapters in chaos and governance, is accompanied by a specific company form. In the colonial phase, these multinational companies were the instrument for accumulation by dispossession. And at some point in the 1990s, we debated how transnationalization of corporations would limit the sovereignty of the state. But the counter to that argument was that the state remained as an executive committee of the bourgeoisie. Now, the digitalization era, would that be a subset of the financialization of capital, or is it a new phase of capital? And what are the socio-political implications then for the company as an instrument for the continued disorganized development of capitalism? And then the last question related to the anatomy of war. If we're dealing with such a highly digitalized form of warfare, where you can displace and disconnect from warfare through instruments, so basically the new technologies of war, like a drone, you can imagine you playing a game and kill someone. So what are the socio-political implications of those kinds of technologies of war? And it's not comfortable to be sitting in the southern point of Africa with all these military bases from both China and India and America lining up on these islands to the east and west, where we will somehow potentially be in the heat, literally, of the conflagration. Apologies for the long.
Thank you very much. Beverly, I would ask you to. Oh, sorry, not the other. No, there wasn't another one. So, Beverly, please. Take a bit of.
Okay. Try. Thank you for the questions there. Undig. What? Covered. Yeah, that one got covered. Yeah, let me start from the atomized social movements one, because I have an answer to it. No, because I've been thinking about it because I had to write a new preface to the book Anti-Systemic Movements, which is this Arrighi Hopkins Wallerstein book on anti-systemic movements. So I wrote a new preface actually to the Spanish edition. And so one interesting thing in that book is they have this, kind of hyperbole, right, about how there were two world revolutions, 1848 and 1968. And they were both failures and they both changed everything. So like they posit this kind of paradox, right? So, they both changed everything in the sense that they changed a lot of discourse about the way people also think about things. I mean, obviously, 68 has, major 68, like in quotes, meaning as a shorthand, right? Kind of upends all sorts of status relations. There's, and then, and the ways in this overlapping to, anyway, I don't go off on the overlap of class and status, but let me stick. So, but then they say that 1868 and 1848 were also failures in the sense that, didn't really end up with state power in a stable way, right? And so the reaction to 1848 was essentially 1917. The reaction was to like a several half-century process of building, of moving toward putting an emphasis on organizations, right? And so, and of moving toward building parties and unions, again, how much of it was like a conscious reflection on 1848 and how much of it was changing structural conditions that favored this kind of, I think anyway, so that, you get then, what becomes the old left, right? So Soviet Revolution, Chinese Revolution, but not just that, also the getting into state power by social democratic parties, labor parties, right? The incorporation of trade unions into tripartite, right? So, and there were a lot of accomplishments out of that. So, like if we look at the long-term data on inequality within countries, almost everywhere, in different forms, in different parts of the world, with exceptions, there's a push, the inequalities within countries decrease, et cetera. And, but there were also kind of, limits, right? And when they say 1968, was in a sense a return to in the organization, in this growing, not universal rejection of organization, but like that, this kind of move away from thinking that the solution is in parties and unions and formal organization, the kind that that it's a reaction to the limits of the old left. So they say that, the new left was, as much anti-capitalist as it was anti the old left. And so now we've had, post 68, like a half century, more than a half century, of this move away from, this formal organization as the solution. And I think that in the last 10 or 15 years, there's this kind of question that gets asked. The far right, they're really well organized. They've got their think tanks. The left used to have its schools and newspapers and study, think tanks, right? And so now, there seems to be like we have that huge waves of social protests, right? But the mismatch between these huge successive waves of protests and the sense of moving closer to a solution, the huge waves of social protests, in the interpretation I was giving, scared the whatever out of elites, and have made them, I'm not going to blame the protests for that, but they become, all right. So anyway, so then, so I think, so how does, so this then becomes just, it's not like, this is again, tools for analysis rather than like exactly what the solution is, because I don't know. But the problem of how to, recognize the reason there was a rejection of formal organization. Because I'm kind of, if you look at the way forces of labor is, there's barely a party or a union mentioned. The advances, come from this mass mobilization from below and forcing elites to, right? But this mass mobilization from below in certain periods, but anyway, okay. So so I think this is I'll just say it's an important question. I don't, the question about about social media and stuff, this is like the two different Gramscian literatures on hegemony. So like where the consent, is more, maybe kind of in the sphere of false consciousness. I don't want to use it, right? But it's in the sphere of kind of getting into people's heads, right? And the common sense thing, the kind of and whereas like there's also like a material, right? So what it is what's left of hegemony is the, to the extent that it's it's in people's heads, right? That, but it can presumably be gotten out of people's heads if there's a material foundation for an alternative vision and organization of life, right? So, but again, so I guess my main thing there is, I think it's definitely not hegemony in the sense of a kind of solution area. The war question got brought up, and I'm circling back, but the war question got brought up on the technology. The one thing is that this capital-intensive warfare, it's like not entirely new. There's been this tendency toward it beginning in the 20th century. It's like now, and different kind of ramifications of that. And so it has, in terms of social compacts, has like this paradoxical thing. It's this paradoxical thing because on the one hand, it makes it those who have access to means of violence, right? It makes it easier to get people to violent things to other people, in part, because the risk to themselves is less because they're, but this is already the 20th century with aerial bombardment and, but now we have, right? But it, the more capital intensive it gets, the more there has been like ways in which states are not particularly dependent on the mass of the citizens fight wars, which is actually a good thing. Yeah, but it's again a good thing, but it's a good thing that points out the limits of the 20th century social compact, which was very embedded in this, military industrial complex in the core and to some less outside, I think, less elsewhere. And and I think this transition to Dario's questions, but is this question of the relationship between state and capital was, I think, where you were going with multinational, that the and whether like, so if we think there, so I think of capitalism as something historical that evolves, that actually existing. At the same time, though, we need static concepts in order to think about what it is now. So static concept, it's or a Weberian ideal type. We can go with the state as the committee for managing the common affairs of the bourgeoisie, and then we ask, okay, how far or close is the state that's, to being a committee, essentially a committee for managing the common affairs of the bourgeoisie, and to what extent is it maybe more of maybe it has completely different kind of priorities than the bourgeoisie's priorities, meaning, or capital's priorities, or maybe it's, kind of a bit more balanced, I don't know. So, so from that, so that's my, my segue to China, because so China, I think that the first thing I had kind of scribbled down to say, is that the hegemonic projects, like at least in the way we've been conceptualizing them, they're always like partly fraudulent, that they can't actually be delivered on fully, in particular within capitalism, because that's the back and forth. If they're delivered on fully, they squeeze profit. They squeeze profits to a level that's unacceptable for capital, and capital goes on strike itself. So they're always like, there's only so far that particularly this kind of 20th century developmentalist and labor capital accords could go in terms of how much of the world could be incorporated, how fast. So there was always a very strong exclusionary element, which was not so much. I mean, it overlapped a bit with the force, but it was about the kind of exclusions that were necessary in order to make it at least partially true as a promise, right? And so I think that and this gets in order to judge this in relation to things that are being said by the Chinese ruling groups, party, state, right? I think that there are two issues. One is like how we think about the Chinese party and state in relation to this kind of ideal type definition of capitalism. And my, because that also in part determines, that in part influences, or, what they're willing to do and not do, or what they're kind of, so my sense over time is that the priorities, because of its particular history in China of party and state, that before profits, there's a whole bunch of priorities: social stability, territorial integrity, social stability also internally, but regionally, and because of this particular kind of history of long distance trade that's related to diplomacy. So because of the stability, that often, a lot of the decisions, particularly if they're decisions about Chinese state investment, there's a little bit more of a problem about controlling the small scale investment that goes on. But it's about, that the diplomatic issues will take priority over maximization of profit, for example, So the question is, so that's, my sense. And the question is, where does the ecological civilization, this promise, because, there's like a really serious discussion about finding a model other than the kind of Western capitalist and US model of production, to find the more kind of resource saving model of development. And they say, we need to learn from Chinese history. We need to learn from other places in the world other than the US, right? Not the US. So there's a serious discussion going on there, and the one can say, it's all just a bunch of, right? So, but the question is, that this is where, I think we have to put it together. They closed, a whole bunch of coal mines. But anyway, never mind. The COVID also was another moment where I'm looking at what they're doing and I'm saying, it's not a capitalist country. I mean, you don't do like that, the things they were doing in terms of, anyway. So this gets to, so I don't know, right? I think I think that because, I don't know, in terms of what kind of, there's certain things I feel confident in, other things it's sort of, we don't know yet, but it's like too much of the literature, just conceptualizes China as kind of the new imperialist power, right? And that it's, relations with the rest of the world are similar. or analogous or, the same, as Western imperialism. You're just changing, the country, right? And I think it's a bit more open and uneven, open and sort of open to contest, right? Open to, so, and that then, like, in terms of where the rest of the world comes in, meaning the third world, or the former third world, or, so country in relation to Belt and Road is, what are the, make the demands have to be made, it's from below, so that from various aspects from below, in order to make these kind of modern day tribute trade relations beneficial. So there's so again, at the level of rhetoric, there's this win-win. How much of the win-win, the Chinese government likes to use the win-win when talking about Belt and Road. So that's a very hegemonic kind of way of putting things. It's a hegemonic project globally. How much of the win-win, and then so it's kind of like, okay, let's push from wherever in the world, right? That's integrated into this Belt and Road initiatives, push to make the win-win, an actual, make it increasingly a true promise rather than a fraudulent promise, and so then basically, then we will also see, is China capitalist? Because if they're capitalists, they'll do what the US did. I mean, in the sense of like with the 70s, when there was the demands for a new international economic order, and a more serious and quicker fulfillment of the promise of development, were coming up as demands. There was a bit of dithering, and then by 1980 to 82, we were just, we weren't serious. End of development project, and 3 decades of, neoliberal structural adjustment imposed, from outside, and successive kind of through successive debt crises. So I don't know what'll, but the important thing is, and this gets to another, I think, aspect of. So I'm tending to talk now, not tending, I actually am, like talking about China. When I talk about China, I'm talking about the state party, but there are all sorts of things happening from below. And so the state and the party are also being pushed from below. So again, how that then, pushes and shifts things in a different, possibly, definitely in a different way. And I was on a panel maybe 10 days ago with Punyai. Some of you may know her, but she's, one of the things she's been commenting on, that she's been noticing, she's China, from China, and she's teaching in Chinese universities, has a lot of kind of relations with internally with young people, with students, and whatever, and so she discussing this kind of really strong return of an interest in Mao from particularly from students. And then I had another student, Liang Guowei, who just finished his dissertation at Hopkins on, he did like this really intensive field work, extensive and intensive field work in China on labor migration and labor market. And he came out of the field work with an argument that, what's happening now, like, in 2010, and like for a number of years beyond, there was a wave of strikes in China, right? And that was the way that like unrest was expressed, that discontent was expressed. And that did have an impact in terms of raising wages and changing some labor laws and, and so so China's not like particularly a super cheap labor place anymore. It's not, that's not the basis of the competitiveness. But he's saying that, even though the wages are, but anyway, he's saying that, and it's an interesting thing because I think it also takes us to thinking about beyond capitalism as we've known it, right? And particularly the 20th century industrial capitalism. He says that, that the striking thing is this hypermobility of labor, like voluntary hypermobility. Like people will like go and work someplace even for a few days, get some money, then move somewhere else. And there's this like, and he has all these life stories of like this really hyper mobility, and then and also people still have land, most of the where he was mainly looking at people originally from villages, rural villages in Guiyang, Guangzhou province, and so he's interpreting it as a kind of rejection of the factory, which then took me back to, because they don't particularly, at this point, they've given up on the idea that they stay and they form unions and they strike. He's saying it's not, that they just don't want to work like that. So sometimes they need money, so they'll go there and they'll work like that. But so that takes us back, like, again, if you think of the crisis of the 70s, so I'm making an analogy with the 30s, but there are things about the 70s. So in the 70s, there was the whole, like movement to refuse work, and there was, Italian. What I'm talking, but also, so that I think that again, it's, so when we kind of try, so what will that mean? I don't know what that will mean in terms of like, how does, what does it mean? I don't know what that, right? Whether then that will push for innovation of new kinds of work, understandings of the relationship between work and whatever, or work and life and livelihood. How that's all going to relate to ecological issues, because I think that, but that rejection of factory work, and other kinds of regimented, I think, these particular people wouldn't be working in offices, but, there's also that kind of rejection, from in terms of other, that, and that's where was also trying to say that if we look at what's happening from below, in part, we might see like kinds of pressures that elites are under to rethink things from above, but they, and they may or may not be up to it, but we definitely shouldn't count on them, because they're highly likely to say, that's too hard, let's just, see if the army will kind of put you all in your place, so yeah, that's we'll see in the US. So, but how these, again, things, whether they're, there's kind of from below, kind of new formulations, whatever, and that circles back, and I don't know if I have, oh my God, I didn't answer. Anyway, that circles back to question of organization, because I think organizations that like party and unions that just kind of try to go back to the to the post Second World War solution, it's not going to work, because we know from the crisis of the 70s, that's where it will lead. It's not going to inspire anybody, because people somehow know it's not inspiring people, because people somehow know it's not the solution, right? So yeah. Was there something I should have answered from Mario? Oh, counterforce. I kind of indirectly, I think counterforces I kind of indirectly answered the BRICS thing, kind of very indirectly. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much for also these extensive answers. And we've finished for today. For those who are really interested in labor, there is also the conference on Monday and Tuesday in the same space. Thank you.
Which I'm forced to speak it very compactly there, because I'm on a panel with 4 other people, I think.